Hello everyone, welcome back to the session. So in this session, we will learn about the texturing, shading, texturing types and how we can assign the texture and the shading upon any model. Hope you have enjoyed the modeling and now you are able to create any kind of prop model in detail in Autodesk Maya application. So after completing the modeling, it's a time to start texturing and the shading. The procedure of applying the texture and the color to an object to create it renderable is the called texturing process. When an object is created by you in Maya application, for example, by default the gray color shader is immediately assigned to it, which will let you start to see the object when you light and render the picture or the scene. As the texture might appearance different after the animating and lighting the scene, it is smart to leave the ultimate adjustment or the final adjustment for later on. We can easily adjust the lighting and the color adjustment in compositing pipeline. Before we start to explore all the techniques and the theory that are involved into the process of texturing, it is essential to see the world around you so as you allow you to understand specifically what you require to create within the computer generated or the CG environment for your scene. A truly essential tool for just about any texturing artist is to make a great reference library. Once you stumble upon a great picture of any type of substance or the surface area, scan it, capture it into your personal hard disk and stash it for upcoming reference for further requirement. This can help you enormously as you must never function without some basic notion of what you are likely to create. To become a texture artist, you should be observed and go through the world in this way and make a habit of noticing all the tiny information in everything and how they are alter how you perceive the real surface. These are the facts you need to create to make interesting and the believable texture, and it will really help you to become a good texture artist. So now we are learning the difference between the shading and the texturing. So shading may be the crucial stage of the procedure whereby we start to create our lighting and begin assigning basic ideas to each one of the model's surface area parameter, for example, color, diffuse, specular, reflection, etc. To ensure that it reacts to light properly. Shading may be the trickiest portion of the process generally, but determining the right value for every of your surface attribute could be the painful process for a small tweaking looking forward the render. So whenever you are putting tiny details in any shading, definitely you should give a lots of time. You should understand the real-time features, what shader required. For example, if you have to make a glass shader, definitely you should understand about the refractive index, how the glass would be reflect and what transparency required in that particular glass. Now we move on to the texturing or the surfacing process. After shading, the texturing required. Now it is actually the procedure where we in fact create average portion texture for our surface, whether using VR pictures or we can use the procedural texture. We will discuss about the bitmap picture or the procedural texture in upcoming sessions. The level of addition detail required depends upon the surface at hand. While the shading made the surface reacts properly to the light, the texture we create simply use those same shading value as the base to include details onto top to create even more realistic feature into your texture. So as we discussed, as we said, there are some fundamental difference between procedural texturing and the bitmap texturing. So what is procedural texture? Procedural technique are the code algorithm or the segment that specifies some characteristics of a computer generated model or effect. For instance, a procedural texture for a marble surface or for a granite surface area does not make use of a scan-in picture to define the color values. Rather, it is a use of algorithm and the mathematical feature to look into the color. One of the most crucial top feature of procedural method is abstraction. In procedural strategy, instead of explicitly specifying a strong detail into the picture or sequence, tag them right into the function or an algorithm and evaluate that process when and where required. Procedural techniques permit the inclusion in style of any preferred quality of physical precision. There are several advantages of procedural texture. So the procedural texture over an image texture as follows. First, a procedural texture or the representation is incredibly compact. The size of procedural texture is normally measured in kilobyte, while the size of texture image is normally measured into the megabyte or MB. This is also true for a solid texture since the 3D texture images are really large. Nonetheless, some individuals have utilized tomographic X-ray scanner to acquire digitalized volume picture to make use as a solid texture. There are some advantages of procedural texture. First is the procedural representation does not have any fixed resolution. Generally, it could provide a complete detailed texture regardless of how carefully you consider it. A procedural representation addresses no fixed region. Quite simply, it is really unlimited in degree and may cover an arbitrary large region without seams and without undesired repetition on the texture pattern. A procedural texture could be parameterized so it can generate a class of related texture instead of being limited to one fixed texture images. There are few disadvantages of procedural texture also. The disadvantage of procedural texture as compared to an image texture or the bitmap texture as follows. A procedural texture could be challenging to build and debug. Programming is hard often and development and implicit design explanation is hard to non-trivial situation especially. A procedural texture could be a shock. It is simpler to predict the result when you scan or color a texture image. Some social people decide to like this property to procedure texture and call it serendipitously. Some cultural people hate it and state the procedural texture too hard to regulate. Analyze the procedural texture could be slower than accessing the key picture-based texture or bitmap-based texture. This is actually the classical period versus space trade-off. Aliasing could be an issue in procedural texture also. Anti-aliasing could be a difficult and the certainly less inclined to be studies here immediately than it really in image-based texturing. What is bump mapping? Probably the most used surface property along with color, bump mapping is a way whereby we can create the illusion of irregularity or the damage. For example, scrapes, dents, and almost any type of textural grain to surface area without increasing or altering the geometry of the model at all. Because no surface nowadays is perfectly smooth, no matter how smooth it could be appear, all areas you create will require some type of bump mapping to be able to create feeling of tangible texture or roughness to the things. Clever use bump mapping conveys the viewer a concept what the top would be feel like to be touched. Bump mapping versus displacement mapping. Just a little tip for improving your bump map is to make sure that your surface has at least a small amount of specularity. In case if you have having problems with viewing bump map or just wish to improve the after effect of your bump map, try upping your specular amount and this may greatly enhance your bump map effect. Okay, so we have discussed the actual fact that bump mapping should not be used to pay too little geometry. Well, perhaps you have ever wishes that there is a method to create geometry utilizing bump map. There exists a way to achieve that and the technique is called the displacement map. But displacement map is totally dependent upon the number of vertices or the polygon. Whenever you have to generate a high detailed displacement in your model, you should add a lot of vertices onto that. Displacement map basically require a texture and deform that geometry of an object based on the texture used. Since displacement map is not actually a texturing issue, it will not go deeply right into the discussion onto it too, as a possible read about the practical program in my application, how we can achieve the displacement map, what could be the difference between displacement and the bump map in our practical session in Maya. However, a thing that we do have considered is normally when to make use or simply bump map texturing. So when to make use displacement, the tricky matter with displacement is normally that get actually great displacing. So you must have high polygons count on your model extremely, which can increase rendering period automatically. Now let's move to the application where we can discuss about the texturing in a practical way.